Welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday, everyone. We're the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
I'm John Kennedy.
And I'm Peter Walsh.
And we are at the penultimate Sunday before Christ the King Sunday. This is proper 28 year C, and we get an apocalyptic text from the Gospel of Luke. And it has parallels in Mark and Matthew. And we get a glimpse of Jesus in his most prophetic tone. So let's hear the text. Luke 21, 5-19. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. But when you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famine and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." So yeah, it's very apocalyptic, and it's paralleled in the other two synoptic gospels, as I said. And notably, Jesus doesn't really answer their question. When is this going to take place, and what will be the signs? He sort of says, you're asking the wrong question, right. I think.
I mean, there's a whole book written, and I wish I knew the name of it, about how Jesus answers questions with questions. It's really interesting when we get plunged into the apocalyptic literature, because it's a way of speaking and a character of speech that is so different than everything else. And you had pointed out in the past when we've talked about this, that Christianity is an apocalyptic religion. It's a part of our discourse in our scriptures. It was part of the Hebrew scriptures. And most cultures do have this sort of discourse. We have it even in the United States, where many people speak in apocalyptic terms about the state of the world or our country, maybe even quite apart from religiously. And that Jesus uses this. And I think that one of the things that's always challenging for us is that this sort of heightened language is the bearer of ultimately good news, that in the end God's realm shall be right, and all shall be full of the justice for the righteous. But that can get lost in the portents that are coming, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely the key thing to keep in mind as we encounter teachings and texts such as this, which are full of language of destruction, of violence, of frightening things, that it is, in some sense, a prelude to restoration, to good news. And in thinking about this teaching with Luke's lens and what's particularly Lucan, of course, one thing that's particularly Lucan is the theme of reversal, right? We get it all the way back with Mary, the mother of Jesus, with her prayer with the Magnificat. God has cast down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. And I think that this is important to keep in mind here, that on the way to the restoration of the world that we were talking about in the last podcast, right? And just like an interesting note that we have two passages in a row here that are very future oriented. Perhaps in certainly in distinct ways, I would say ultimately in related ways, but that on the way to this good future, the present order of the world needs to be shaken up quite a bit, and that in some sense this is what it looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the apocalypse, the word, it means revelation or unveiling, right? So Jesus, his presence, his ministry, his words, his confrontation of his own tradition and the ways that he sees it missing the mark in terms of God's covenant with the people and their responsibility. He's revealing the human propensity towards death, like we said last time, and towards violence. And I think he's saying that, he's speaking to them also about his death. He's talking about his own temple of his body, that he's going to be crucified. And, when this happened, he's really going to shake up the whole world. It's going to change everything. And, history tells us it did. So I think he's warning them that when they follow in his way, revealing the systems of the world that bring about victims and death and retributive violence and cycles of violence. These things are inevitable, that there will always be pushback. Power will always seek power and always seek to blame a victim. We're seeing that writ large in our society right now. And we are worried, it causes fear. And Jesus is giving them this message. Do not be afraid. Do not be terrified. I mean, how can you not be terrified when he goes on to describe all these things? But that's his message to them is these things are inevitable when you take this alternative path and follow in my way. And that's the unveiling. Yeah.
Interesting. This morning I was listening to a Kundalini chant called Jama. Some of you may know it. And one of the parts of the chant is I would like to see beyond the other side of this illusion. Now, this is a completely different theology, but actually really appropriate for this, which is to say that all the destruction, there's a power of grace behind all of this that will eventually emerge. But what I just want to come back to for a second here is just the particulars of the piece here. So his prophecy is the destruction of the temple because of a failure to recognize that the prophet Jesus has arrived. There are prophecy for the signs and warnings for the end of time. There's going to be political upheaval. There's the earth and cosmic upheaval, and that this is a time of testimony. Mm-hmm. If we date Jesus at death at 32 or 33, then we move forward to the year 70 and the destruction of the temple, and then 10 to 15 years later, Luke's writing all this down or putting this all together. Mm-hmm. But all the things that Jesus talks about do come to pass. There, in the time between Jesus' death and the destruction of the temple, there were wars and insurrection. The Jewish War, so-called First Jewish War, Second Jewish War, was an insurrection which led to the destruction of the temple. Nation did rise against nation. There were, in antiquity, they find earthquakes and famines and plagues. And we know from the Acts of the Apostles that people were arrested and persecuted, handed over in synagogues to prisons and brought before kings and governors because of his name. And that, again, in the Acts of the Apostles, we have an opportunity to testify. It didn't look like Paul was preparing his defense, that he got some words, and that we saw people betrayed by parents, brothers, by relatives and friends. And some did die, and some were hated. So that all this did come to pass. And so perhaps by the time Luke pulls all this together, we can look back and say, well, Jesus was a prophet who spoke the truth, and this all did come to pass. And yet we find ourselves in a timeless time in which the world is still quaking, nations are still rising against nations, and all this stuff is in some sense still going on also.
Yeah, and in a real sense, all the more, right? I mean, like, we live now for the past 80 years-ish in a world in which the means to end the world is actually in our hands with nuclear weapons. So this is all the more true as time has gone on. One thing I'd like to point out, just in terms of it by way of helping sort of unpack and take this bite by bite and make it more digestible. Like you were saying, Peter, I think it's so worth underscoring that we really need look no further than the events detailed, let's say, in the Acts of the Apostles, as you said, to look for the fulfillment of most of what Jesus is talking about here. And a lot of scholars, such as N.T. Wright, who was sort of the main character of our previous conversation, think that Jesus in this passage is talking only about events that happened in the first century CE. That maybe as it moves on in the next passage, which we actually got at the start of this liturgical year that is now ending with Advent 1 of 2024, we'll be moving on to Matthew's version of that in a couple weeks' time. But maybe as the discourse, the so-called eschatological discourse, moves on to talk about the coming of the Son of Man, maybe this is talking about the second coming, which has not yet happened. But we're not getting this in this particular pericope, and that it's very, very possible to read this as all stuff that happened in the apostolic period, in the decades following Jesus's earthly ministry and so on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm getting stuck on when you said the second coming hasn't happened yet, because I think that there is an argument that has been made by some that the second coming was the resurrection of Jesus, and that now we're in the aftermath of that. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation. Mm-hmm. But I think that some of these things are up to question. And I think that Jesus saying, when you hear of wars and insurrections, for these things must take place. I mean, I think he's so aware of the cycles of violence, and you're right, it played out in real time in the generation following him. And it hasn't ended, as you've said. I mean, it's crescendoed, and it does it over and over again throughout history. And I think that the call to discipleship is to continue in this perseverance, knowing these things are not the end, and they're not our end, and they're not the end of the story either. And that to testify, what are we to testify to except the countervailing reality of the kingdom of God that Jesus introduced, made way for, trains us for, guides us into, accompanies us into, and to stay the course, and what people are meant to testify to is, in my opinion, like the futility of this violence. And I think it just can't be overstated, and it can't be stated enough that it is our end. Like, it's the end of the world to commit violence against violence, to the point where the so-called righteous violence is indistinguishable from the so-called evil violence. And that's what Jesus was sort of revealing by taking the place of the nonviolent revealer, that he is showing how futile this is. So I think we just don't see it. Generation after generation after generation, we repeat and repeat and repeat the victimization and, commit war, commit crime. Like, we just see it. It's right in its moment because God said to do it, or God is calling us into it, and, giving it some righteousness. It's all very meaningless until people stop doing it. And it's a lot to say in my little response.
Well, thank you. No, you're talking about the cycles of violence.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's my framework for understanding what Jesus is trying to say here, and to call his disciples out of that preoccupation, out of that morass of chaos and doom, to have clarity and to be trusting that the Holy Spirit is going to allow them to testify in a true way. So I think, I just like to put that framework on the table.
Yeah. I agree with you on that. And the opportunity, where he says there, the opportunity to testify, which is the same word that we would use for witness, which is the same word we would use for martyr. All in the Greek get translated in different ways. And Jesus was a martyr of witness as he testified to a different way, to the divine way. Yeah. I agree with that, but I'm also struck by this thing that is in our scriptures is still present with us today. So when it says here, the temple is very important to Luke. And so, I mean, the whole beginnings, the first 2 chapters of Luke, a lot of it takes place around the temple. Speaking about the temple, and adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, that we can breeze over the temple too quickly. I think sometimes the temple, adorned with gold and these stones and the way it sets on the Temple Mount, glittering, that the whole of the Jewish people, the people of Israel, is circled and cycled around this. The home of God was literally there, and the whole religion was centered here, which was their governance, everything. So the destruction of the temple is the destruction of their complete way of life. And so the synagogue movement, which starts after the destruction of the temple, but the destruction of the temple is very much alive in our politics today. Mm-hmm. So the Third Temple movement, the Second Temple, obviously a biblical time, but now what is known as the Third Temple movement, by certain groups of Jewish people and Israeli Jewish people, is a very powerful force. And if you go to the Temple Mount today, there are drawings of what the Third Temple would look like. The movement of Israelis, Jewish Israelis, on the Temple Mount. What in the area that the Muslims call Noble Sanctuary, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is so offensive to the Muslim community that the heinous and horrifying act of October 7th was named after Al-Aqsa because of what those folks believed was the incursion of the Third Temple movement on to what is now their holy site. So this destruction of the temple thing isn't just the thing that kind of happened and went away and Jesus said, well, I'm the new temple. Mm-hmm. This temple thing is still the primary thing rocking a whole portion of the world as people of Israel, and the Palestinian people and the Muslim world, and Christians have very little to say about this except for the very right evangelical wing that uses our New Testament to say things about the reestablishment of this temple and the bringing back of Jesus, which is not the whole of the Christian world. But what Jesus is talking about here, this is an enormous deal. Enormous.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, so striking to be reminded of, in a certain sense, how little has changed, right? How little has changed in the more general terms that you were talking about, the cycles of violence and conflict, chaos, confusion, playing out generation after generation in different places with all these different particularities, but also that this specific situation of conflict and destruction centered in the Holy Land, in Jerusalem, in the site of the temple, how that's still with us and still in some ways connected to questions of the end of the world for a lot of people is absolutely fascinating. I think also, I mean, Peter, as you said, how Christians, for the most part, although it doesn't always seem like that in our country, have little to say about this conflict, have little stake in this conflict relative to the Muslims and Jews who are really not, the ones who are in conflict over this, are seriously locked into this conflict. I think is such a good illustration of a point I heard you making, Elizabeth, of how Jesus points us in another direction, right? I think of what he says to the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4. She's saying, your people say we must worship here. We say we must worship over there, and Jesus is like, I'm telling you, the time is coming where you will worship neither on this mountain nor on this mountain, but in spirit and in truth. Mm-hmm. And Jesus liberates his followers, his disciples, from this sort of tribal territorial religiosity, the zero-sum game, where, if our enemy has this land or has a monument on this land, then we are desecrated in some way. We must strike back. Mm-hmm. That Jesus just kind of says, no, okay, all the earth is the Lord's and everything that is in it, right? We don't have to divide up the land and fight over it. That's not what God's calling us to do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm remembering William Barber III, the Poor People's Campaign, guy who's so active now, and he says that prophets must be fluent in the language of both grief and hope. And I think that Jesus is doing that here, where he's really a realist. Like, this temple, it's beautiful as it is, gifts dedicated to God, all these stones will be thrown down. And, these temporal things are so easily swept away, and we can't even imagine it, but that's the way it is. And, it is grievous for his people, of course. And, of course, by the time Luke was written, it had already happened. And I think that the story of Luke is disciples on a road going towards greater and greater union with Jesus's vision. And, everything important happened on the road in Luke. I've said that before, but, he's like, you can't just put all your hopes in a building. And that's not exactly what he was saying, but in a sense, just like what you said, he liberates the Samaritan woman, and from these ideas, he's always mediating a way for us to directly come in contact with the divine. And I think that all these things that swirl around us, faithful disciples have to keep a clear head and not be shaken by the falling down of our institutions and our temples, things we worship, our systems, our commerce, everything. We worship these things like they're our God-given rights and tools and all, And I feel like Americans are especially given to that because we have this DNA of manifest destiny, and, we're God's gift to the world, and our land is God's gift to us. And, these things are idolatrous. They just are. And important and sacred as they are, and people have fought and died and shed their blood to defend them. And I'm the first to, revere the heroes of our history to defend our way of life. But it's still not as good as the way of life we have following Jesus and becoming disciples who make room for everyone. And, I think that's where this is so, blasts everything open, that we, we have temples of our own that will be thrown down and that are being thrown down.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Very, very thought-provoking and well said to me. I think that, we get into the questions of different religious dispositions and their foundational nature and cultures. If you go, sometimes people in the United States, I think, are guilty of living in the United States only and not realizing that there's a whole other planet out there. We're actually not that big a place. When you get to the size of China, you get to the size of India. We're like a state in some of these places, and they have very different dispositions. So that, for instance, if you go into another culture, you go into a Buddhist culture, they have a very different disposition, because one of the tenets of Buddhism is that all things are passing. And so their attachment, they don't attach in the same way to certain things, because they have a major tenet that all this is passing, which is essentially what Jesus is saying. All this is passing. When the so-called National Cathedral was finally dedicated, Brother Martin Smith, the former superior of the Society of St. John the Evangelist, and a most powerful man of Jesus, preached at the service and used this passage that not one stone will be found on another if it's not exactly this passage. It's one just like it in one of the other scriptures. And he said there was an audible gasp because they had just spent millions and millions of dollars putting these stones one on another, and that this would all in some day come down. And that I think that when we get to the end of this and we get that thing, but not a hair in your head will perish, by your endurance you will gain your souls. When the previous sentence to that was, they will put some to death. And so now he's saying, what could this mean? I think this question about not one hair in your head will perish is, what is imperishable? And this goes almost even back to our previous conversation that we had in the previous podcast. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, talking about the perishable body becomes imperishable, that the divine dimension of life ultimately is imperishable, and that our being and our whole of everything that is alive will in the end not perish, but the endurance here. I think that one of the things that's super interesting here, Elizabeth, and with the context of what you're talking about, is this insights that came from the Girardian understanding of the cycle of violence, and that's how we get our happiness and our joy. That what Jesus is saying is that the amazing thing here is he's saying when all this terrible stuff is happening, and this coming out in antiquity, nowhere does it say fight back.
Mm-hmm.
So he takes, as you would say, the nonviolent approach to this, and endurance is to do the divine right thing, and that is where you gain your soul.
Yeah.
And that is the ultimate thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do not lose your soul. Gain your soul.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right on. Yeah. I mentioned in the last podcast, Bob Marley, and last night, and continuing this rock musicians or reggae in Bob's case, who are people of faith, talked about Bob Dylan. He has a great song, "With God on Our Side," from his protest song days in the early 60s. And it's, this song is saying, I was brought up learning, in all the history books and all my classes about all the American wars, and how, when we fought the Indians and the Indians died, God was on our side, right? He has this great line. I learned about the First World War. I never really got straight what we were fighting for. All these people died, but, God was on our side, right? There's this narrative that God is on our side, and that therefore our wars and our conquest mentality, this uncritical idea that we are God's gift to the world, as has been said in this conversation, this equating our ways and our culture and our system with God's ways is totally idolatrous. It doesn't mean that all of our ways and our values and our culture is bad. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that it's provisional and limited, and it can only be good insofar as we acknowledge its limits and acknowledge that it's not the same thing as God's ways and God's truth and so on. And the song ends on this brilliant note, if God's on our side, he'll stop the next war. That is the sign that God is with us when we are being led into peace. Yeah,
that's a great
Thank you. Love that, as we said off camera, love that you bring Bob Dylan and Bob Marley into our conversations in great part because this is how we live. We don't live in an exegetical moment all the time with our, we live real life. We turn the radio on, so to speak, we do other things.
And it is the voice of the poets that see us through these hard times. I mean, it's really important. They're not just songs we hear on Spotify, but they're actually the voices of prophetic truth so often, right? And I mean, it's really important to know. I think when you're attuning to, the teachings of Jesus or, truth, you know it when you feel it. And I feel like sometimes art gets at it so much quicker than anything we can say based on study. And that's the thing, like you said, like not all our ways are idolatrous and bad. I mean, when we get it right, we know it. We know it when we're doing right by the poor and right by the lost and the hungry and the oppressed. I mean, we know when we get it right. We enacted a civil rights law, and not to get into all our history, but there are times you're actually aligning with the vision. You have a greater society, more just, more loving society. Right. And, no country, no politician is ever going to save us from anything. But when we get it right, it feels good. It helps us all live larger. So, I mean, I think that's all I was trying to say, is not to malign our nation's history, because I love this country, but it's important to say sometimes we don't get it right?
Yeah.
And I think Jesus loved his tradition. He went to the temple for every feast. He didn't miss participating in his tradition. So surely it was grievous to him that it was threatened and coming down, but he wasn't afraid to call out its flaws and its ways of getting it wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I love it when we come back to Jesus as the person. And this, must have been incredibly grievous to Jesus. I mean, he was a devout Jewish man who who received at his baptism this enlightenment, this enlivenment, this enlovement that came from the divine being, but that was all part of who he was. It was his, love for his tradition, and he takes his tradition and shapeshifts it, and seeks to be not only the Messiah of Israel, but of the Lord of all. And this is the thing that we get in Luke's gospel, I think, which is what Luke is trying to apply, is Messiah of Israel, to be Lord of all, to be the bringer of the way of the divine light, life, and love. And that as part of that, it gets into this witness. And since you're talking, hang on a second, since we're in my office.
I looked at that too.
Yeah. Here I've got. I have so much junk in my office. You wouldn't believe it. We should sometimes take a tour of the office. But this is a Brian Stevenson quotation that I keep before me so that I don't ever forget it. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. And speaking of prophets in their own time, Brian Stevenson, a holy man, and to understand that as the disposition of your heart, there is both a freedom and a battle as one seeks to do the divine thing and to care for, as you're often quoting, John, the disposition of God and the favor of the poor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Amen.
Well, we probably could wrap it up, and
that, or we could talk for another 3.5 hours.
Yeah. I mean, like I've said before, I don't have anything to add that wouldn't add another 15 minutes.
I know, same here.
So
it's all or nothing.
We have a staff meeting here we've got to go to.
But I wanted to mention that we have a guest preacher, Maggie Don, who's an Episcopal priest. She hails from the UK, but she is an ordained Episcopal priest in the United States. And she'll be our guest preacher. She's going to first lead a women's retreat overnight, Friday and Saturday, and then be our preacher on Sunday. So don't miss it. She's got a lot to say too. No, none of us know what she'll preach about, but continue your conversations about this and engaging with us. And thanks for listening.